When I came home from Vietnam the last trip, my wife said to me, I was standing at the door of the kitchen. She was working in the kitchen. I was standing at the door yarning to her and said, you know, you've changed this time. You've changed. What's wrong? What happened? I said, no, I'm all right. This is the time when PTSD was frowned upon. You know, you're less than a man if you admitted to it.
I can give you an example of several extreme cases of veterans from World War II. The first one was a gentleman who was a prisoner of war. The first thing we had to do was remove the bed from his room, because when he came home from the war, he never slept in a bed. He always slept in a chair because he had to be ready for danger.
I've been at Fairview for the past 15 years, so I've encountered a lot of people with dementia at various stages of their dementia. And PTSD has not been a common phrase used. I think the only person that we have is the one resident, Jack McGee, which actually has a technical diagnosis of it. But if you look at the age of this population of people and what they've done in service, they would have to have PTSD. If we looked at a cohort of them about 10 years ago, I had a number of them that would scream out at night. You'd go in the room, say, are you okay? And they'd say, oh, I'm not screaming about anything. Go back out, 5 minutes later, they're screaming. But they would not ever explain, and most people with PTSD don't talk about it.
The sad reality is that they probably didn't have access to resources and clinicians and different treatment options. And I think that they've probably suffered in silence for a very long time.
Well, I graduated in 1964, so when I graduated as a young doctor, there was still a lot of Second World War veterans in our community. In the First World War, they talked about shell shock and cowardice. In the Second World War, they talked about war neurosis. We knew very little about it. The psychiatrists knew very little about it. There was no real psychological function then that we had the use of.
PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a psychiatric condition. It's been recognised as the name PTSD since about 1980, but before that it was present in patients, but it was called other names, shell shock and things of that nature.
Dementia is an umbrella term for a set of disorders, all to do with loss of memories. So dementia from Alzheimer's disease leads to gradual loss of short-term memory, for example, gradually losing the ability to look after oneself, to dress oneself, to remember how to use a knife and fork, all manner of things, unfortunately.
So we call that problems with the recall of recent narrative memory. The memory for past life, maybe 30 or 40, is often better preserved, but it's the recent memory that's a problem.
PTSD can occur due to traumatic events in civilian life, such as motor vehicle accidents, sexual assault, but it can also occur commonly in veterans who've experienced military service. So we know that PTSD is quite common among our veteran population as well.
It's got three major symptom clusters. The first issue is the exposure to some traumatic incident or a number of traumatic incidents. And then the person develops what we call intrusion symptoms, so that they get nightmares about the trauma, or they get severe memories that make them very upset and very anxious. The second type of symptoms are what we call avoidance symptoms. And so the person spends a lot of their mental energy trying not to remember what happened because they know that it's so distressing if they do go back into that area. The third major group of symptoms are what we call hyperarousal. They're sort of anxious, they're on edge, they are always worried about their security, but it all relates back to some exposure or multiple exposures to what we'd call very severe traumatic events earlier in their life.
The worst thing I've ever had in my life was that marauder hand in mid-air collision in cloud nearly. When I first saw the silhouette starting to appear, I had 0.4 a second to do something.
I have two mental pictures retained in my brain. One is that silhouette of a banked plane appearing through the cloud, and next is the base of that plane going down a canopy.
We know that veterans, on average, who've experienced combat, about 10 to 20% will develop long-standing chronic PTSD. I mean, that's been shown in studies of Australia, in the United States, and the Vietnam-era population of veterans from both countries, and in more recent conflicts as well. So anybody looking after veterans who are older, and particularly if they're looking after them and they have symptoms of dementia, ought to be thinking, is this one of the 1 in 5 or so veterans that may have PTSD and dementia?
So the link between PTSD and dementia is very interesting. This research started about 10 years ago with some large epidemiological studies in the United States of veteran populations.
And they identified veterans who did and did not have post-traumatic stress disorder, and then followed them up over a period of 10 years. And they found that the ones who suffered from PTSD, on average, had about twice the risk of developing dementia over the period of the 10 years.
This was a very interesting finding that has since been found in other studies as well. So we think that there is definitely an association between PTSD and the development of dementia as the person gets older.
The next question is, well, why is it so? And we don't have an answer to that, but there are some sort of suggestions as to why this might be. The condition of PTSD is a stress-related condition. It can alter the stress hormones in the body, primarily the cortisol hormone system. And we know that exposure to long-term higher levels of cortisol leads to degeneration of the hippocampus. The hippocampus, of course, is the part of the brain that's responsible for recalling recent events and past events, and that's the thing that can be disturbed clearly in Alzheimer's disease. So that's a potential physical connection between PTSD and the presence of dementia later on.
An older veteran has a very different brain scan in many instances because, for example, if they do have onset of dementia, they will have a more diffuse loss of grey matter from all over the brain, generally speaking. So if they've had PTSD for a while, what happens is they lose that classic PTSD fingerprint, if I can put it that way, whereby we see those 3 areas affected. It's more a diffuse whole brain changes that we look. Some are just basically from normal aging, some may be related to the dementia, and some may be a progression of the post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a bit of a mixed picture for the older veteran.
What's important to recognise is to think about, the symptoms of PTSD. We think that as the brain deteriorates with dementia, PTSD episodes may start to come back again. So for the people caring for the person with PTSD, they need to be aware of what were those triggers in the person's history.
For a short time and go back full time, I was lying on the ground on this track and just lying there. And then, whoosh, this bloke's head appeared in front of me. He's in khaki, he's in Viet Cong, and he's got an AK-47. 2 hours, over a 2-hour period. I can remember a bead of sweat running down my back, into my backside, and I can remember an ant crawling over my back. And I thought, well, this is it. This is a $64 question. Will I hit him or won't I? So I took the gap and I squeezed it off and hit him in the face. And that's when I started to shiver and I started to sweat and I started to dry reach because I'd never killed a bloke in that close. You know, I'd lived it 2 hours, but the heat was off. He wasn't there anymore, he'd gone. I never went back to see him. I didn't go back to see where he was, what he'd done. Apparently that's the one that caused the PTSD. The fear of being shot.
If they've got dementia symptoms and they've got PTSD, what things are likely to trigger this? Well, it's probably going to be very unique for each individual veteran because their exposures to traumatic experiences will be different, and so the triggers will also be different.
So triggers can happen, I think, in any time in any part of their life. They could be walking along and something just sparks a memory. It could be dreams.
Well, I had an incident the other night. A little black bloke came into my room and he had an AK-47. He went over and sat in my room under the desk. He just sat there, and I called her. I pressed the press buzzer and got one of the. And I said, "That bloke over there said there's no one there." I said, "Well, he's over there. He's got an AK-47. He's going to do me in, shift him out, put the lights on." So put the lights on. There's no one there. It was just a dream. It was something. So that sort of outbreak that happens occasionally, but.
I think from what we know now and from what we do now for the current veterans, I think it's the right thing. People are provided with care very, very quickly and they're looked after a lot better because we understand the condition better now.
So the most common triggers in an aged care setting for residents with PTSD, with dementia, would be loud noises, unfamiliar staff, inconsistency with care staff, being overwhelmed by the media, television or newspapers, being argued with, being told what to do versus being encouraged to do something or invited to do something.
So if something surprising happens that leads to some physical aggression or leads to some verbal aggression, it's worth reflecting on, well, where the person was, what the environment was like. Was it too hot or too cold for them? Were there other people in the room? Was the person very tired?
So these behaviours are usually in response to an unmet need. That is their way of communicating, and it's up to us to determine what this unmet need is.
That sort of careful reflection on what happened beforehand, then what happened carefully during the behaviour, and what were the consequences afterwards. That can give them some hints on how to handle it next time.
It's the way you present yourself to them, and it's your body language, which will spin off, and they can take that on board. And it's certainly a lot. Even putting out a hand and saying to them, "Oh, come with me," and just showing them that you're a friend, that you're there to help them. Even saying the words, "I'm here to help you," will settle them down.
I've got two very good carers. They give me a tolerance that I don't give others. I think I'm tolerated more than the others. You're in a routine. It's certainty. It's like the sun coming up.
The care workers contribute an awful lot of knowledge to those care plans because they know exactly how they shower them, when they shower them, what they do, how to dress them, do they need help with dressing, not dressing. The care workers are your biggest source of a resource in a facility.
When you're communicating with a resident with PTSD or dementia, you need to be mindful that communication is not all about what you're saying. Facial expressions. Try to be open and try to be empathetic. So the important thing to remember about communication, it is not just what you say, but it is how you say it. When a trigger occurs, the care worker needs to get involved when there is a safety issue for either the resident themselves, for another resident, or for the staff.
Sometimes that means physically removing the other person so that they can't be assaulted. It means reassuring the patient, trying to calm the patient down, giving clear instructions, building environmental reactions or responses to this.
So for example, if someone is fantasising that they're back in the war and they have to get their men out of this situation, By knowing the rank that the person had when they were in the war, whatever it is, colonel or lieutenant or whatever, and being able to address the person by that rank, that may then assist them to ease them out of that situation and to help them to move on to something else.
You need to be non-threatening. You need to try and encourage the person's trust as much as you can. New staff members need to be brought in very carefully.
When someone new comes along, they don't always accept somebody new. They prefer the way it is. They love routine. Yeah, they like to stick to their normal routine. So a change in routine can also trigger off a behaviour.
So it's just a matter of being aware that there may be more heightened levels of arousal, that they may interpret things in a more negative or hostile sort of way, and that they need to be supported as much as possible, and to keep things clear and explained, and make sure that you say what you're going to do before you do it, so that the person has an awareness of what's happening rather than being surprised by the situation.
We all learn about our residents through communication and observation, but not every staff member learns the same thing. We all know something different, and it is part of putting that jigsaw puzzle together, so that instead of just getting little bits here and there, we put the puzzle together, and then we can come up with a plan as to what is the best way to communicate and respond to our resident and look after their needs.
I would advise carers watching this video to try to be as supportive as possible, to not try to do it on their own. Don't take the weight of it. Share it amongst your team members. Case conference it with the families. Families are usually a very good source too of helping.
Well, I think the key message for care staff who are looking after patients in aged care facilities is to know your patient and to know what their background is. And if they are a person who's served in the military in Australia, they do have a different profile of potential risk factors than other individuals. And it's important to consider that.
Person-centred care is obviously one of the stalwarts of our work in aged care. Really understanding what the individual needs and what their history is.
I'm fortunate enough to be able to live here. The care here is superb. I've been very happy here. You couldn't ask for better care than you get here.
For a resident with PTSD and dementia, person-centred care is the most important thing. You cannot look after a resident unless you focus on them as a person. You need to understand them. You need to understand their history. You need to understand their family dynamics. You need to understand their activities of daily living, what their hobbies were, what they like to do. You really, really need to have a holistic picture of that person. Come to work wanting to care for them as you would want to be cared for, as you would want your father or your mother to be cared for. And at the end of the day, going home knowing that you've done everything in your power to make that day a better day for that resident.